On Saturday, October 21, the Ferrymead Railway in Christchurch held a Railfans Day to celebrate 150 years since F13 first entered service. This 060 saddle tank is the oldest operational steam locomotive in New Zealand, having been built in 1872. Incredibly, she wasn't withdrawn until 1963, having spent her final years in service as a shunter in Lyttelton. Besides F13, a pair of D-Class 240 tanks were also in operation. This was especially interesting to me, since the only member of this class I had seen previously was D170, which was on display at Helensville Station. Although the railway is quite short, the Ferrymead Railway is still a fascinating place to visit, especially if the sheer variety of motive power they've got is anything to go by, although not much of it is actually operational. Some of the engines are future exhibits for the National Railway Museum of New Zealand, and it makes sense for that museum to be built here because it's close to the site where one of the original Canterbury broad gauge lines used to run, and that network first opened in 1863. My first catch of the day was a very early morning KiwiRail service at Whiteley Avenue. This was train 717 coming down from Picton, with DXR 8007 and DXC 5264 on the point. Sometime later, after the sun had risen, I tried going out to Rolleston again, aboard a design line diesel bus number GB1029 on the Orbiter and MAN diesel number GB5472 on the number 5. This time, I actually caught something at the station. It was the TranzAlpine with DXCs 5212 and 5229 leading the charge once again. The day before, one of the tramway's staffers told me that 152 would be carrying passengers again on Saturday, so I tried to find her while waiting for the number 8 bus. "152 was built in 1910 by Boone and Company of Christchurch, so I thought it was most appropriate for her to still be running in her home city. Although it was severely damaged in the 2011 earthquake, the cathedral is slowly being rebuilt, but according to the signs all round the building, it won't be finished until at least 2027.
One of the few projects in Christchurch that hasn't gone over budget. Covers 2 city blocks. Going a lot better than everyone planned. Almost booked out till next year. Centre the empty theatre can handle 1,700 people, 300 people in breakout rooms, 900 people.
Upon arrival at the Ferrymead Heritage Park, I was greeted by this bizarre tram number 236, a drop-centre double saloon type from the city of Brisbane, Australia. In addition to the 3-foot 6-inch gauge railway and 4-foot 8.5-inch gauge tram line, there is this charming replica of an old-fashioned town at the Heritage Park, otherwise known as Ferrymead Village. This place reminds me of the Taranaki Pioneer Village at Stratford, although their railway uses a bizarre steam outline diesel locomotive, and it certainly isn't 3-foot 6-inch gauge. 236 was built in 1925, and ran in Brisbane for an impressive 43 years before her retirement in 1968, just 1 year before the system's closure. Initially, she was owned by the Wellington Tramway Museum and leased to the Tramway Historical Society in 1985, but it wasn't until 2021 when she was sold to the THS. This was a well-timed picture, if I do say so myself, and I say that mainly because of that pukeko that happened to be walking along the front porch. Over at Moorhouse Railway Station, I found F13 waiting to leave with her old-fashioned coaches, which look even older than the wooden coaches I'm used to, the sort of thing you can see at the Goldfields Railway. In addition to all the rail fans, a crew from News Hub was also present at the railway, and they ran a story about F13 on the telly later that evening, although I stupidly forgot to watch it. Meanwhile, electric locomotive EO45 was parked on a nearby turntable. This locomotive has truly had the history of all time, having been built by Toshiba in 1968 for service on the Otira to Arthur's Pass section of the Midland Line, which was electrified at 1500 volts DC, and ended up losing its electrification in 1997. In 2008, after at least a decade in storage, she was reactivated for additional commuter services in Wellington. This is when she received her current livery. Classmates 51 and 74 were also refurbished, but this EO trio didn't last too long in Wellington's service, as they were only intended as a stopgap measure until the Matangi EMUs arrived. After the fact, EOs 51 and 74 were scrapped at Hutt workshops, along with the unrefurbished classmates 39 and 68. EO 45 is now the sole survivor of this class. As for the modified ex-British Rail Mark II coaches that were pulled by the EOs, designated as the SE class, they are still in use on the Masterton to Wellington service. You can tell them apart from the more common SW variant solely by looking at the windows. DC 4876 arrived at the Ferrymead Railway in August 2022, having been saved for preservation by the NRM ONZ project. This locomotive was originally built as DA 1492 in 1967 and rebuilt by Clyde Engineering in 1983. She is quite significant for a few reasons. A. She was the last DA to DC conversion. Despite being numbered in the 4900 series, the 5 Hutt rebuilds actually took place before 4876. B. She retained the classic fruit salad livery throughout her entire post-rebuild life, even well into the KiwiRail era. C. She also retains her original 80s era cab, complete with the little recession that would have housed a tablet catcher. For reference, the last line in this country to use tablets instead of normal signals was the Wairarapa line, not giving up the ghost until 1994. And D. I was never able to see 4876 running under KiwiRail ownership. Just across from where DC 4876 was parked, there was this classic NZR Road Services bus. Ferrymead's 2-foot gauge railway has been closed for quite some time, with the track now looking very overgrown, but this diesel locomotive doesn't look too shabby by comparison. If my research is correct, this is Planet 040 number 3484, originally built in 1950 for the salt works at Lake Grasmere. While F13 continued simmering away at the station, I turned around to see what was happening at the sheds, and found a D140. This locomotive was built by Scott Brothers of Christchurch in 1887, but she was still undergoing an overhaul when I last saw her in 2018, and didn't re-enter service until 2021. Like the green 060, Ferrymead is also the home of this 240. The same is true for the locomotive that was sitting just in front of D140. This is W192, an iconic 262 tank engine built in 1889 at Addington Workshops. Her historical significance comes from the fact that she was the first locomotive built by NZR themselves, and at one point in the 1980s, she even ran on the Johnsonville line with F163. Sadly, she last ran under her own power in 2014. Having visited Gisborne back in June to see WA165, I have since noticed a strong resemblance between her and W192. However, the WA class came later, with 165 being built at Hillside Workshops in 1898. Strangely enough, only 2 examples of the W class were ever built, numbers 192 and 238, in stark contrast to the 11-strong WA class, although that number doesn't include the 4 engines that were converted from J-Class 260s. One of D140's classmates was also present for F13's birthday. This is D16, not to be confused with the LNER Claude Hamilton 440s, and she was built by Nielsen and Company of Glasgow in 1878. This locomotive was visiting from her home base at the Pleasant Point Railway, and this was the first time I had ever seen her. Meanwhile, 3 more steam locomotives were resting in the shed behind W192 and D16. The 2 up front were C864 and WD357, with the latter being a 264 tank built by Baldwin of Philadelphia in 1901. She bears a very strong resemblance to the Ruby Basin 280, as seen in the video game called Railroads Online. The D-Class 240 tanks continued idling in the yard for a fair while, so I went over to another part of the yard and found a trio of diesel locomotives. DE511 and DG772 are both English Electric products, built in 1951 and 1955 respectively. They are part of the Diesel Traction Group's fleet, along with DI1102 and DE512, although these 2 are up at the Weka Pass Railway at the time of uploading. Behind the DG, I noticed her larger double-cab counterpart. This is English Electric DF1501, the sole survivor of a once 10-strong class. She was built in 1954, and after many years spent on display in Otahuhu, she was sold to the Diesel Traction Group and moved all the way down to Christchurch in 2009. 14 years later, she is currently undergoing restoration to working order, but according to Mr. Caleb Clayton, a member of the Canterbury Railway Society, the work won't be finished until 2029. Meanwhile, horse-drawn tram number 43 is on display in the Hall of Wheels. She was the first major restoration project for the Tramway Historical Society, and actually ran through the suburb of Papa Nui in 1964 along some tram lines that hadn't yet been removed, despite the closure of the original Christchurch tram network around 10 years earlier. This Manning Wardle 040 saddle tank is also on display in the same hall. She was built in 1914 for the Christchurch Meat Company, and remained in service until 1975.
Yippee! Yeah. Will you be based down there, or you stay in Middle? Okay, thank you for making yourself available for this. Okay. I understand it's only till 5, 6? 5, 6-ish. Yeah, 6-ish. Lovely. No, lovely. Yeah.
In the same area as DC 4876 and EO 45, we found the so-called Supergans EMU, consisting of motor car EM 1373 and a trailer car ET 3373. This unit was built by Gans Marvag of Hungary for Wellington suburban services in 1982, and retains the unique Metlink livery that she received during her experimental refurbishment in 2011. From what I can recall, this was the prototype for a project that would have seen the entire Gans Marvag fleet refurbished and painted in Metlink colours. But in the end, the Greater Wellington Regional Council ended up selecting another batch of Matangi EMUs instead, and the Gans Marvags remained in service until 2016. This is the only footage I've got of the Supergans from when she was still in service, taken at Paikakariki in July 2015. Then it was finally time to go for a ride behind a F-13, who was just out of shot to my left when I got this footage of the double Ds. The obvious joke basically wrote itself. We decided to ride on board D26, a bizarre little four-wheel coach built in 1874, which is an awful lot older than I initially thought. She's got wooden seats in the second-class compartment, and what looks like leather seats in the first-class compartment. As pointed out by Rolleston Rails, she doesn't even have gates on the balconies, unlike the more modern wooden body coaches. Again, like the ones that you can see at the Goldfields Railway. After seeing D16 and D140 leave the station, I got stranded at Ferrymead for a rather long time, and it was starting to do my head in. It turned out that this was due to a photo shoot they were doing with the trio of active steamers, although no one told me about this until after the fact. So instead, I waited for the Brisbane tram to show up and asked the motorman if I could ride back to the Ferrymead village on his tram. I returned to Moorhouse Station to find F13 and D140 still idling near the crossing, while D16 had run off with 2 coaches. I missed filming TR22 dragging WD357 out of the shed, but I wasn't too fussed about that, especially since I was perfectly happy to see the locomotive at all. This was an especially significant moment for me, as I had never really been able to get a good roster shot of the WD before. She is one of a select few Baldwin-built locomotives left in this country. The preservation group up at Maymorn are working on restoring WBs 292 and 299. C864 was built by NZR's Hillside Workshops in 1931, with the C-Class 262s being designed primarily for shunting duties, as evidenced by the shape of their tenders. She is one of only 2 examples of this class that made it into preservation. The other one is C847 up at the Silverstream Railway. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Heisler number 1450 as well. This geared steam locomotive was built in 1922, and the design is quite distinctive due to her cylinders being arranged in the shape of the letter V. Meanwhile, the trio of operational tank engines were busy shunting, taking passengers, or getting serviced outside of the shed. with thanks to the previously mentioned Mr. Clayton for allowing me on WD357's footplate. I've already been in the cab of a DE, specifically 507 at the Glenbrook Vintage Railway, so instead we had a look at DG 772's cab and engine room.
Yes, it does.
This is an English Electric 6 SRKT Mark II prime mover, which only produced 750 horsepower. Having found the DG's cab to be rather cramped, it's no wonder that 10 of these locomotives were rebuilt with new, albeit ugly, cabs between 1978 and 1980. DG 772 still looks like she's in good condition, and don't quote me on this, but apparently she hasn't run any mainline excursions since around 2019. Meanwhile, F13 was still idling in front of WD 357, but it wasn't long before the other locomotives started moving again. Even though the big triple header was still to come, I decided to leave the Ferrymead Railway due to feeling rather tired. And by this point, I was content with what I had managed to film. On the way back to central Christchurch, the timing worked out well enough for me to catch one last KiwiRail service at Garlands Road in Opawa. I believe this was train 975S, led by DC 4801 and DXC 5304.